If anyone had told Josie Hartley that a rusted cast-iron sewing machine would drag her into the room where a whole neighborhood's fate got decided, she would have laughed in their face. That afternoon, she was only trying to keep an old woman from breaking her back in a parking lot. She had no idea she was walking into a test. February in South Philadelphia isn't a storm. It's a cold, patient drizzle that slicks the asphalt into an oil-black shine, the kind of cold you feel in your knees just looking out a window. Josie was 27, working doubles at Otis's diner, and she'd just finished a lunch shift with $4 in tips folded into her apron pocket. In that same pocket was a hospital notice for $41,000 she'd read so many times she knew it by heart. She cut through the lot behind the church, head down against the rain, and she saw the old woman. She was standing at the open trunk of an aging Buick, a small woman, her headscarf soaked dark. At her feet sat a Singer sewing machine, the full cast-iron treadle kind, a thing that weighed more than 2 women put together. She worked her hands under the base, set her jaw, and heaved. It lifted maybe an inch before it dropped back onto the concrete. She let out one sharp breath, braced a hand on the bumper, and stood there a long while, rain gathering on the edge of her scarf. A black windowed sedan rolled past, slowed for half a second, and kept going. Josie could have kept walking. Almost everyone was. Her feet hurt. Her night shift started in 3 hours, and she had $11 in her wallet, but she stopped. There was a reason she turned away from the bus stop and walked toward that old woman, though, at the time. Even to herself, she lied and said it was only because the woman reminded her of her mother. It would be a long time before Josie understood one thing about that afternoon. She wasn't the one who did the rescuing. That old woman had been waiting for her for 3 months. An old woman waited 3 months, and it changed a waitress's entire life. If this story reached you, leave a like. Share it with someone who needs the reminder that kindness is never wasted. And subscribe so you don't miss the next story about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Josie left the bag of leftovers Mr. Otis had packed for her on top of the trash can and crossed through the puddles toward the Buick. The sound of her shoes striking the wet concrete made the old woman snap her head up. Her face was small, with deep wrinkles carved around her mouth, and her eyes immediately hardened like a door that had just been bolted shut. "I can do it," she said. Her voice was hoarse and clipped, with the cold edge of someone who had said those words many times in her life. Josie didn't stop walking. She didn't argue either. "I know you can," she said, stopping an arm's length away, both hands turned palm up where the woman could see them. "But this thing weighs more than the 2 of us put together. If you leave it there, you won't be able to get out of bed tonight." The old woman looked at her. Then she looked at the sewing machine at her feet, looked at the trunk that came up to her waist, and Josie could clearly see the small battle taking place across that face, between pride and gravity. Gravity won. "Antonia," the old woman said. Just one word, tossed out the way someone might hand over loose change. "Josie." She took off her coat and draped it over the trunk lid so it wouldn't get in the way, and the rain immediately soaked through her uniform, making her shiver. She bent down to examine the base. The sewing machine was an old one, with a solid cast-iron treadle stand and 2 crossbars along the sides thick enough to slide her hands beneath. The iron was so cold that touching it sent an ache all the way to her elbows. "You stand on this side," Josie said, pointing to the right, closer to the trunk. "You just keep it from tipping over. I'll take the heavy end." Antonia gave a snort. "You think because I'm 76, all I can do is hold something steady." "I think because you're 76, you know what you're lifting," Josie said. "If you're going to lift, use your legs. Don't twist your back. 1 twist and that's it." The old woman shot her a quick glance, and there was something in that look that seemed to have just been noted down somewhere. But she said nothing. She only slid her bony hands beneath the crossbar on the right. Josie lowered one knee onto the wet concrete, planted the toe of her shoe firmly for traction, and slipped her hands underneath. "I'll count to 3. 3 means lift, not 4, she counted. On 3, they both strained upward. The machine came off the ground slowly and heavily, as though it didn't want to move. Its weight bit into Josie's palms in a line of aching pain, driving down through her thighs and into knees that had already spent 6 hours standing. She heard Antonia let out one short breath through clenched teeth, and she knew the old woman was carrying more than her share. "Move left, left," Josie said through her teeth. They turned. The iron edge was slick beneath the rain, and Josie's right hand slipped for a fraction of a second. The machine tilted, and the cast iron edge sliced across her palm with a burning sting. She didn't cry out. She simply grabbed hold again, tighter this time, and forced the machine upright. "Are you all right?" Antonia asked, her voice suddenly different. "I'm fine. Hold it. Don't let go." They managed 2 more steps. The edge of the trunk struck the sewing machine base with a metallic clang. "Set it on the lip of the trunk first," Josie said. "Don't try to lift the whole thing. Put it down, then push." They lowered the machine onto the edge of the trunk. It rested there precariously, and for 2 seconds both women simply breathed. Then Josie shifted her grip, put her shoulder into it, and pushed. The sewing machine slid across the trunk floor with a long grinding sound, then slipped all the way inside, settling neatly between the 2 wheel wells. The entire Buick sank slightly on its old suspension. Josie straightened and held both hands out beneath the rain to ease the sting. A thin red line ran across her right palm, and the rain was washing it away. She closed her hand and hid it inside her sleeve. Antonia didn't thank her right away. She leaned back against the car, one hand still resting on the trunk lid as if to make sure the machine was truly there, and she looked at Josie. She looked for a long time. It wasn't the look of someone who had just been helped. Her gaze traveled from Josie's shoes, worn down at the heels, to her soaked uniform, paused at the hand she was hiding, then rose to her face. It was the look of someone who had just opened a ledger and placed a check beside a line that had been waiting there for a very long time. Josie noticed it, but she was cold. Her hand hurt, and her evening shift started in 2 hours and 40 minutes, so all she thought was that this old woman was difficult and probably a little strange. "You've done this kind of thing before?" Antonia said. "I studied nursing once. 3 years. Josie picked up her coat from the trunk lid and shook the water from it. "They teach you how to carry people before they teach you how to save them." "Studied." The old woman repeated the word, not as a question. "I didn't finish." Josie put on her coat. "It's a long story, and the rain is cold." Antonia nodded slowly, as though that answer, too, had already been waiting in that ledger. Then she closed the trunk with both hands and asked, still without looking at her, "What was your name again?" I didn't hear it clearly. "Josie," she said. "Josie Hartley." The old woman went still for a beat. Just one beat. So brief that later, when Josie remembered it, she wouldn't even be certain she'd seen it. Then Antonia nodded. One neat, decisive nod. The nod of someone who had just heard the exact name she'd been waiting for. "Hartley," Antonia said. "Yes." Josie was about to turn away when Antonia opened the driver's door, reached inside, and pulled out a steel thermos dented along one side. She unscrewed the cap and poured a small measure of thick black liquid into it. Steam rose into the cold rain and immediately dissolved into a thin mist. Then she held the cap out to Josie without saying a word. "I don't need it, ma'am," Josie said. "Take it," Antonia said. "I made it this morning. It's warmer than you are right now." Josie took it. The steel cap glowed warm against her stinging palm, and she took a small sip. The espresso was so strong it was almost harshly bitter. No sugar, the kind of coffee someone made for herself rather than for guests. It ran down Josie's throat like a thin stream of fire. The 2 women stood there in an empty parking lot behind the church, rain falling steadily on the trunk of the Buick, passing a capful of coffee back and forth like 2 people who had known each other for 30 years. "What did you buy that sewing machine for?" Josie asked, only because she wanted something to say. "My son bought me an electric one," Antonia said. "Plastic. Had a screen on it. He pressed 3 buttons and told me all I had to do was choose the stitch. 3 months later, it broke. They told me it had to be sent back to the manufacturer." She patted the trunk lid, beneath which rested the cast iron machine they had just lifted inside. "This one will bury both you and me, and still be running afterward." "You sew a lot?" "I mend clothes for some families around the neighborhood. Hem pants, replace zippers. They offer me $5. I won't take it, so they bring me a cake instead." Antonia poured another sip into the cap and handed it back. "I don't need their money. I need my hands to have something to do. You understand." Josie nodded. She understood all too well. "My house is very quiet," the old woman continued, her eyes fixed on the iron fence at the far end of the lot. "Have you ever lived in a house so quiet you can hear the refrigerator? You can hear yourself swallow. My husband died 8 years ago. 8 years, and that house still hasn't learned how to get used to it." Josie said nothing. At 27, She had already learned that when someone spoke about a person they'd lost, the worst thing you could do was interrupt with words of comfort. "My son keeps telling me to move in with him," Antonia said, and something in her voice shifted, becoming harder. "His house is big. Someone cooks. Someone opens the door. Everybody in this neighborhood calls him Sir. You understand me? Men 60 years old see him on the street and take off their hats." She took a sip of coffee. "But he looks at everybody the way he'd look at a gun. The mailman, the man who sells bread, everybody. If I moved into that house, I'd become a clock hanging on the wall, with somebody coming by once a day to dust me." Josie held the steel cap and slowly turned it between her fingers, and the pieces began fitting together. A 76-year-old woman driving an old Buick alone to a flea market. A son whom 60-year-old men took off their hats for when they saw him. A sedan with blacked-out windows slowing for exactly half a second before moving on. Here in South Philadelphia, those pieces formed only one picture, and Josie had lived here long enough to know there were certain names you didn't ask about. She finished the last sip and handed the cap back. "Your coffee is good." Antonia screwed the cap back onto the thermos. Then she said, her voice light and casual, as though she were asking about the weather, "You work at Otis's place, don't you?" Josie froze. For half a second, everything in the parking lot seemed to go still, even the sound of the rain. She replayed their entire conversation in her head, one sentence at a time, and she was certain she hadn't told the woman where she worked. She had only said she'd studied nursing for 3 years and hadn't finished. She looked at the old woman's face, and something flickered faintly at the edge of her memory. A small face beneath a headscarf sitting at the counter near the kitchen, glimpsed through the service window between 2 shifts. One afternoon, or perhaps many afternoons, she didn't know. But Otis's place served 80 customers a day, and Josie waited on 40 tables every shift. She pushed the thought aside. "My shirt," Josie said, looking down at her chest. The word Otis, embroidered in worn gold thread, was half hidden beneath her coat. "You've got sharp eyes." "Yes," Antonia said. "Your shirt." Then she turned away and opened the car door. Before getting behind the wheel, Antonia reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small, hardbound notebook with curled corners and a pencil stub so short she had to hold it between 3 fingers. Then she turned to a blank page and held both of them out in front of Josie. "Your phone number." Josie looked at the notebook. On the facing page were several slanted handwritten lines in Italian, some numbers, an address. "Ma'am, I only helped you carry a sewing machine," she said. "You don't owe me anything. Go home and get warm before you catch a cold." "I know I don't owe you anything," the old woman snapped, and the cold edge in her voice returned in full, exactly as it had when she'd said, "I can do it." "Did I say I owed you? I want your number. Either give it to me or tell me no. I've stood out here getting wet long enough." Josie laughed. She took the pencil stub and wrote her number on the page, her handwriting trembling slightly from the cold. Antonia looked down and repeated each number quietly to herself, then closed the notebook and slipped it into her coat pocket, as carefully as someone putting away a lottery ticket she'd already discovered was a winner. Then she opened the car door. In the instant the door swung open, and the dome light came on. Josie saw a phone vibrating over and over on the passenger seat, its screen glowing white inside the dark car, with only one word written in capital letters, no last name, no number, Rocco. It vibrated, went dark, then immediately lit up again. Antonia didn't look at it. She simply reached over and turned the phone face down on the seat, without the slightest change in her expression. Settled behind the wheel, and closed the door. The window came down about the width of a hand. "Take this," the old woman said, holding a neatly folded tissue through the opening. "Your hand is bleeding. Don't let the rain get into it." The Buick started after 2 tries, coughed out a cloud of gray exhaust, and rolled out of the parking lot, leaving Josie standing there with the tissue pressed into her stinging palm. Unable to understand why such a deep chill had suddenly run down her spine, Josie walked to the bus stop with the wet tissue wrapped around her hand. For the entire 40-minute ride, she thought about the old woman's nod when she'd heard the name Hartley, until she grew so tired that she dozed off. By the time she got off the bus, she had forgotten almost all of it. She reached home at nearly 7 o'clock that evening. She hadn't even taken off her coat when Danny came charging out of his room, his socked feet sliding across the hardwood floor, one hand holding a sheet of paper high in the air like a flag. Look at this. Slow down. Let me take my shoes off." "No," Look now." The 9-year-old boy grabbed her wrist and dragged her into the kitchen, slapped the paper down on the table, and patted it with his hand. A math test. 9 out of 10, marked in red ink, with a little smiling face his teacher had drawn in the corner. "I only got one wrong. The division problem, and Marcus only got 6. 9 out of 10. Josie let out a long whistle. "So who do I have to call to get the mathematician's autograph?" The boy burst out laughing, the kind of laugh that showed every tooth in a mouth, still halfway through losing its baby teeth. "Josie, can you buy apple pie tomorrow? The kind from the corner shop, the one with sugar on top." "Apple pie for someone who got 9 out of 10, she said. "I'll buy it tomorrow after work. You promise?" "I promise." He held out his pinky. She hooked hers around it, and the boy ran back to his room to finish his homework, shouting something to himself about apple pie as he went. Josie stood in the kitchen listening to his footsteps, and she waited until his bedroom door closed before she sat down. The stack of papers lay at the edge of the table where she'd left it since Friday, and she pulled it closer. The rent was going up another $75 beginning next month. The electric bill. The hospital statement with the figure of $41,000, which she'd looked at so many times that it didn't frighten her anymore. It only made her tired. And at the very bottom was the follow-up appointment slip. The one piece of paper in that stack she couldn't bring herself to put beneath anything else. It was for Danny's upcoming knee surgery, a congenital joint defect that was getting worse by the month, threatening to leave him with a permanent limp if they couldn't afford the procedure. She sat there for a long time, adding today's $4 in tips to what she might make on tomorrow night's shift, and she realized she was calculating how much an apple pie with sugar on top would cost. She folded the stack of papers, pushed it into the drawer, and went to wash the cut on her hand. 4 days later, in the middle of her evening shift, her phone vibrated in her apron pocket while she was carrying 3 plates to table 7. She read the message in the hallway behind the kitchen, beneath the yellow light where Mr. Otis kept the calendar hanging. An unfamiliar number. "Josie, this is Antonia. I'm inviting you to lunch, tomorrow at 1 o'clock, Il Passero, Passyunk Street." Josie read it a second time, then a third. Il Passero. She knew the place. Everyone who lived in this neighborhood knew the place. And it wasn't the kind of knowing that came from simply knowing a restaurant. It was the place where prices weren't printed beside the dishes on the menu. It was the place where black cars sat double parked outside all through lunch, and somehow no one ever came to leave a ticket on their windshields. People from the neighborhood lowered their voices when they walked past, not because they were afraid, but out of habit. The kind of habit handed down from their grandparents. She texted back, "Ma'am, you really don't have to do that. That cup of coffee the other day was enough. Thank you." Her phone vibrated immediately, so quickly that the reply had surely been typed out beforehand. "I've invited you. Don't be late." Josie stood beneath that yellow light for another moment, grease still on her hands, hearing Mr. Otis shouting from the kitchen that table 7 was waiting. That night, after she got home and turned off the light in Danny's room, she opened her closet. She stood there for a long time, running her hand along each hanger. 2 restaurant uniforms, 3 t-shirts, 1 pair of jeans faded almost white at the knees, and all the way in the back, wrapped in a dry cleaner's plastic bag, was the only decent dress left in the entire closet, a charcoal gray wool dress. She pulled it out and immediately remembered the last time she'd worn it, because she'd only worn it once, 2 years ago. She hung it from the hook on the door, sat down on the edge of the bed, and stared at it for a long time in the darkness. Josie arrived on Passyunk Street at 12:57, 3 minutes early, because she'd walked the last 2 blocks instead of getting off at the proper stop, so she'd have time to breathe. From the outside, Il Passero looked like nothing meant to impress, just a brown brick facade with its name written in small gold letters on the glass. But along the curb in front of the entrance, 3 black cars were double parked, blocking an entire lane, and there wasn't a single ticket tucked beneath a windshield wiper. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. It was so warm that the glass behind her fogged over. The floors were dark wood, and the voices were kept so low that she could hear a knife touch a plate at the table farthest away. The hostess stood behind a small wooden podium, smiling, and while she smiled, her eyes made one slow journey from Josie's shoes to the charcoal gray wool dress, paused for half a beat on the handbag with its worn strap, then rose to her face. The smile didn't change, but the calculation had been made, and the answer was not enough. "Good afternoon. Do you have a reservation?" "I'm here to see Mrs. Antonia," Josie said, Antonia Vitale. The hostess touched a finger to the screen, scrolled down, then back up. I don't see a reservation under that name. Are you sure it's today? 1 o'clock. The 18th. Let me check again for you. Her finger began scrolling again, more slowly this time, and Josie understood that she wasn't searching anymore. She was simply stretching out the moment until the woman in the wool dress, standing in front of her, understood on her own and went home. Josie had been waiting tables for 9 years. She recognized the trick by the second. She opened her bag and took out her phone, about to call the number that had texted her, when a man's voice came from behind her. You're Josie? The voice was deep, not loud, but the entire dining room heard it. Josie saw the effect before she even had time to turn around. A waiter passing with a tray immediately leaned aside to clear the way, even though the aisle was wide enough for 3 people. At the table to her left, the sound of silverware stopped for exactly half a beat before beginning again, and the man sitting there suddenly became very interested in his glass of water. And the hostess, the same hostess who had been scrolling across the screen only moments before, now stood perfectly straight, both hands resting on the edge of the wooden podium, and when she opened her mouth, her voice was entirely different. Good afternoon, Mr. Vitale. Your table is ready. Josie turned around. The man stood 2 steps away, his left hand tucked into the pocket of a black wool coat, his other hand empty. He looked to be around 30, with close-cropped black hair and a faint scar cutting through his left eyebrow, old enough that it had faded white. He didn't smile. He wasn't in a hurry either. He simply looked at her, his gaze moving across her face, down to her hands, then back up again, and Josie had the strange feeling that she'd just been completely read. I'm Rocco Vitale, he said. Antonia's son. Josie tightened her grip on the strap of her bag. Where is she? My mother is at home. He didn't emphasize a single word. She doesn't know this lunch exists. I blocked it off her calendar. Josie stood still for a beat. In that beat, she thought about turning toward the door. She thought about saying thank you. I'm sorry. I have an afternoon shift. Then walking to the bus stop and never answering if that number called her again. She thought through all of it in less than 2 seconds. Then she thought about the old woman standing in the rain with her bony hands beneath that mass of cast iron. And she thought about the strange nod when Antonia heard the name Hartley, and she wanted to know, then who am I having lunch with? She asked. Me. He turned without waiting to see whether she would follow, and walked farther inside. Josie followed him. They passed tables covered in white cloth, and she could feel the quick glances being thrown in her direction, not because people were looking at her, but because they were looking at who she was walking behind. Their table was in the corner beside a window overlooking the row of rain-darkened rooftops across the street. He sat in the chair with his back to the wall and his face toward the front entrance, then gestured to the chair opposite him. Josie sat down, placed her bag on her lap, and only then did she notice. She lifted her head and looked around. The table to their left was empty. The table to their right was empty. The 2 tables behind her were both empty, their tablecloths perfectly smooth, glasses turned upside down, not a single place setting laid out. The restaurant was in the middle of the lunch rush, the door opening and closing constantly. Yet there wasn't a single person seated anywhere in the entire circle of tables surrounding them. And in the moment Josie understood, a chill ran down her spine, the same chill she'd felt standing in the parking lot and watching the Buick drive away, because people didn't clear the tables around you merely to keep a conversation private. If privacy were the point, there would be a private room, and a place like Il Pasero certainly had private rooms. People cleared the tables around you in case someone at this table raised their voice, and so that if it happened, there wouldn't be a single pair of ears close enough to hear. A waiter appeared, set down 2 glasses of water, and disappeared so quickly that Josie didn't even get a clear look at his face. Rocco Vitale reached inside his coat, took out a thin file, placed it on the table in front of him, and rested his hand on top of it. He didn't open it. He kept his hand resting on the file for a long while without opening it, and Josie understood that those papers weren't there to be read. They were there only for her to see. Josie Ann Hartley, he said, 27 years old, born in Grays Ferry. You've worked at Otis Marsh's diner for 9 years, currently 2 shifts a day. The morning shift starting at 6 o'clock, the evening shift ending at 11 o'clock. Your average monthly income before tips is $1,900. He spoke evenly, never raising his voice, his eyes fixed directly on her face rather than on the papers. Your mother died 2 years ago. Cancer. You were the one who signed her admission papers, and you were the one who signed her discharge papers. The remaining hospital bill of $41,200 is in your name. You're paying $150 a month, and at that rate, you'll finish paying it when you're 55. You studied nursing for 3 years at community college and dropped out in your 3rd year. You're the legal guardian of a 9-year-old child. Josie sat perfectly still. You don't have a criminal record, Rocco said. That's a point in your favor. She placed both hands face down on the white tablecloth, carefully, the way someone might set down something fragile. The cut across her right palm had scabbed over, and she could feel the skin pulling tight as she flattened her hand. When she spoke, her voice was quieter than before, but the pleasant manner of someone who had spent 9 years waiting tables had vanished completely. You investigated me. I investigate everyone who appears around my mother. I carried a sewing machine. You carried a sewing machine, he repeated, and for the first time something hardened in his voice, in a parking lot behind a church, 2.5 miles from my mother's house, on an afternoon when she was supposed to be at home, at the exact hour when not a single person in this world knew where she was. He removed his hand from the file, the first movement he'd made since sitting down. Do you know she does this every week, Miss Hartley? She gets into my man's car outside her house. She tells him to take her to the market. She walks in through the front entrance, then leaves through the butcher shop in the back. Some days she gets on a bus, rides 3 stops, then gets off in the middle of the route. Some days she cuts through the church courtyard, where there are 2 exits, and if my man is waiting at one, she leaves through the other. He paused. 4 hours. Once. 5. Then she comes home, hangs her coat on the hook, and asks me if I've eaten. Josie said nothing. Last Tuesday afternoon was the 11th time, Rocco said. I called her 14 times. She didn't answer. My man lost her on Mifflin Street at 2:15, and I found out where she'd been at 5 o'clock that afternoon, when she arrived home with a cast-iron sewing machine in the trunk that she couldn't possibly have lifted in there by herself. He looked at her. Have you ever picked up the phone and called your mother when not a single person in the world knew where she was, Miss Hartley? And Josie, before she had time to think, answered, yes. The word fell between them and lay there in the silence. She saw him hesitate for half a beat, a hesitation so small that if she hadn't spent 9 years waiting tables, reading strangers' faces to know which table was about to ask for something else, she would have missed it. But mine was different, she said. With mine I knew where she was. I just didn't have enough money to take her somewhere else. Rocco didn't answer. Josie lifted her hands from the table, folded them in her lap, and looked straight at him. All right. Then let me say this back to you clearly, just to make sure I understand what you're suggesting. Her voice remained quiet. You think I stood out in the February rain, in a parking lot behind a church, waiting for a 76-year-old woman to go buy an old sewing machine. I waited there, probably since morning, so that at the exact moment she couldn't lift it, I could pretend I just happened to walk by. I pretended to help her carry it. I pretended to cut my hand so it would look convincing. I pretended to drink her coffee. And what exactly was all of that supposed to accomplish, Mr. Vitale? So I could get invited to lunch here? She leaned slightly forward. What's the grand plan? What exactly do I get from an old woman who mends clothes and gets paid in cake? Go ahead and tell me. I'm genuinely curious, because in another 40 minutes, I'll be late for my evening shift, and that shift pays me $64. Silence followed. Somewhere at a distant table, someone laughed, then immediately fell quiet. And Josie saw it, the thing she would remember for the rest of her life. A tiny crack passing across the face of the man sitting opposite her, lasting no longer than a blink. His eyes shifted slightly. It wasn't that he believed her. It was simply that, for the first time that afternoon, he was no longer certain. Then he reached inside his coat and took out a thick brown paper envelope. He placed the envelope on the table and pushed it slowly across the white tablecloth with 2 fingers until it stopped directly in front of her. It was thick and heavy, and the flap wasn't sealed, only folded over. So when it came to a stop, the edge opened just enough for Josie to see what was inside. Cash, stacked in bundles, still wrapped in paper currency straps, the kind of bands that only came from a bank. $10,000, Rocco said. I'm grateful that you helped my mother. She isn't supposed to lift anything heavier than 11 pounds, and if you hadn't been there that day, she would have hurt her back trying to do it herself. I'm paying you for that. He sat back upright. But this ends here. No more messages. No more lunches. If she calls you, you don't answer. Josie looked down at the envelope, and for 1 second, exactly 1 second, her breath caught in her chest. Because she wasn't a saint, and because her mind had already begun doing the arithmetic before she could stop it. $10,000. 3 months of rent, even with the increase starting next month, the electric bill for the entire winter. And there would still be enough left for an amount she'd never allowed herself to turn into a specific number. The deposit the hospital had told her, in a very polite voice, had to be paid before they could put anything on the schedule. The amount she lay awake every night, staring at the ceiling, and didn't dare calculate. It was sitting there inside a brown paper envelope, less than 2 arms' lengths from her hand. She looked up, and she saw his face. Not pity, not contempt, just a calm sense of completion. The expression of someone who had finished watching an experiment and recorded the result exactly as he'd predicted from the beginning. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at the envelope, waiting for her hand to reach for it. Everyone had a price. He'd believed that for 8 years, and in another 30 seconds, he would have one more piece of evidence to keep believing it. Josie reached beneath her coat. She was still wearing her restaurant apron underneath, because she'd come straight here from her morning shift and hadn't had anywhere to change. She slipped her hand into the apron pocket, where crumbs of bread were still clinging to the fabric, and pulled out everything inside. 1 $5 bill, 4 $1 bills, wrinkled and limp from sweat and from being crumpled in her pocket all morning. She smoothed them flat on the table, one at a time, without hurrying. Then she placed them on top of the envelope, and she pushed both back toward him. $9 is for my water, she said. The rest is yours. Take it. You need it more than I do. Rocco didn't move. For the first time since she'd entered this restaurant, he didn't know what to do with his hands. Josie stood. She braced both hands against the edge of the table, leaned slightly forward, and when she spoke, her voice was very quiet, so quiet that he had to lean toward her to hear. That day in the parking lot, your mother told me about you. She said you were rich. She said everybody in this neighborhood calls you, sir, that 60-year-old men take off their hats when they see you on the street. She told me all of that in a voice I thought sounded proud. She paused for a beat. Then she said you look at everyone the way you'd look at a gun. The mailman, the man who sells bread, everybody. At the time, I thought it was just a mother complaining about her son. The kind of thing where she'd say, my son is difficult, my son refuses to get married. She looked down at the envelope lying between them. Turns out she was being very generous. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. I've been sitting here for 40 minutes, Josie said. You read me my mother's name, the day she died, the amount of money I still owe, and my little brother's age. You know everything. You know I'll finish paying that debt when I'm 55. You even know what time my shift ends. She picked up the strap of her bag. And you still don't know a single thing about me. She pushed her chair neatly back into place, the ingrained habit of someone who had spent years waiting tables. And before she turned away, she left him with one final sentence. I've known who the Vitalis are since I was 19, Mr. Vitale. You're the one who doesn't know who I am. She walked out between the white tablecloths, and this time no one glanced at her, because the entire dining room had lowered its eyes to its plates. She didn't wait for the elevator. She pushed open the door, marked exit, and took the stairs down. 6 floors. The sound of her shoes striking the concrete steps rising and echoing back at her in a steady rhythm, and she kept walking until the heat inside her chest began to cool. When she stepped onto the sidewalk, the wind coming off the Delaware River struck her full in the face, cold enough to bring tears to her eyes. Josie stood there for a moment and let it hit her, cold but clean. Then she checked the time, saw that she could still catch the 3:10 bus, and headed toward the stop, because her evening shift paid $64, and she needed every single one of them. That night, after her shift ended at 11 o'clock, Josie sat on the bus home and opened her contacts. She found the number that had texted her 4 days earlier, the number she hadn't gotten around to saving under a name, and blocked it. Then she put her phone away and stared through the rain-streaked window until she reached her stop. For the next 3 days, she worked like a machine. She picked up the split afternoon shift she normally refused, those 3 awkward hours suspended between the 2 ends of the day, simply so she wouldn't have to sit still. Mr. Otis stared at her on Wednesday and told her she looked like someone had taken something away from her. She told him it was the weather. Wednesday night, she sat at the kitchen table with the stack of bills pulled from the drawer, working through the same calculation over and over, one she'd done hundreds of times before, and that always came to the same answer. She opened her phone, went to the list of blocked numbers, and stared at that string of digits for a long time. Her finger rested on the screen. She thought about two numbers. One was 41,200. The other was 10,000. Then she thought about the expression on the face of the man sitting across from her while he'd waited for her hand to reach out. And she turned off the phone, placed it face down on the table, and went to bed. Thursday night, Danny was sleeping over at a friend's house after the birthday party of a boy from the neighborhood, so the apartment was empty and quiet in a way Josie wasn't used to. She was standing at the sink, eating the leftover takeout from her evening shift, when someone knocked on the door. 3 knocks, slow and firm, evenly spaced, the way someone knocked when they knew for certain there was someone inside. Josie wiped her hands on a towel, walked over, and looked through the peephole. Then she unlocked the door. Antonia Vitali stood in the hallway, holding a round tin box in both hands, her headscarf removed and draped over one shoulder. And behind her, 2 steps away, beneath the peeling hallway light that no one in the building had replaced in 3 years, stood Rocco. He was still wearing that same black wool coat. He stood there in a hallway that smelled of dampness and the cooking from 4 different apartments, as out of place as a slab of stone someone had carried in and set down in the middle of a living room. "You blocked my number," Antonia said. "Yes, ma'am," Josie answered. "I did." "Why?" "Because your son made himself very clear. I'm a danger to your family. I thought it would be best if I didn't bother anyone anymore." Antonia stood perfectly still. Then she slowly turned around and looked at her son. She didn't say a single word. She only looked at him, and Josie stood in the doorway, still holding the dish towel, witnessing something she would tell people about many times later in her life. The man who could make an entire neighborhood lower its voice when passing his restaurant. The man 60-year-old men took off their hats for when they met him on the street, standing beneath the sickly yellow light of an apartment hallway, and after 7 seconds, lowering his eyes slightly, Antonia turned back. "He's an idiot," she said. "Ma." His voice broke on that single word, low and urgent, and for the first time Josie heard that man lose control, even if only for 1 syllable. Antonia paid no attention. She held the tin box out toward Josie. "Almond cookies. I made them this afternoon. Let me inside. This hallway is drafty." Josie stepped back and opened the door wider. Antonia walked in as though she'd been coming there for 20 years. She set the tin of cookies on the kitchen table, looked around once, then rapped her knuckles against the wall beside the door twice, producing 2 solid knocks. "Real brick," she said. "There's brick behind this plaster. Houses today are built out of cardboard and drywall. A neighbor coughs and you hear it through the wall. This place will still be standing 100 years from now." "It keeps the wind out," Josie said. Antonia walked to the refrigerator and opened it without asking permission or saying a word. She stood there with one hand holding the door, the cold white light falling across her deeply lined face. Inside was half a carton of milk, a carton with 3 eggs left, a jar of apple jam, and the paper container holding the leftovers Josie had just been eating. There was nothing else. The old woman stared inside longer than necessary. Then she closed the refrigerator very gently, and she didn't say anything at all. Rocco had come inside. He didn't sit down. He stood beside the window with his back to the glass, and his eyes settled on the refrigerator door, where Josie had attached everything important in her life with magnets. A follow-up appointment slip with a date circled in red pen. Her work schedule for the month, packed solid, without a single empty space from Monday through Sunday. And in the middle, pinned higher than the other 2, was a crayon drawing of a bright red fire truck with an absurdly long ladder, a name scrawled unevenly in the bottom corner. He looked at it for a long time. He didn't ask a single question. Antonia pulled out a chair, sat down, and pointed to the chair across from her. "Sit," she told her son. "Talk to the girl." Rocco pulled out the chair and sat down. He didn't take off his coat. He placed both hands on the yellowed plastic tabletop, and when he began to speak, his voice was steady, never rising or falling, the voice of a man who had told this story inside his own head so many times that it no longer hurt him in the ordinary way. "My father died when I was 26. Heart attack. In the kitchen, at 4 o'clock in the morning. I took over everything within a week, because in my family's line of work, people don't give you time to grieve." He paused, then continued. "4 years ago, My mother started leaving the house. Josie pulled out the third chair and sat down. Before that, she didn't go anywhere alone, he said. When my father was alive, they went everywhere together. To church, to the market, to visit her friends. After he died, she sat inside the house for 3 months. Then one day she said the house was so quiet, it made her ears ring, and she started walking to the market, to church, sitting on benches, talking to strangers. She can talk to anyone. That's just who she is. She'll go to the butcher shop to buy a pound of ribs and stand there talking for 40 minutes. It's called living, Antonia said without looking up. Rocco didn't answer that. At the bakery on 9th Street, there was a girl who used to buy bread at the same time as my mother. He continued. 24 years old. Her name was Nadine Falco. She complimented my mother's scarf. Then the next time she remembered what kind of bread my mother liked. Then the time after that, she carried my mother's bags all the way to the bus stop. That's how it went. A little more every day. He looked down at his hands. 3 weeks later, they were having breakfast together. 2 months later, she was coming to the house. 4 months later, she had her own chair at Sunday dinner, sitting beside my mother, and my mother called her daughter. Josie sat perfectly still. She was there for 8 months, Rocco said. During those 8 months, she wrote down what time my family ate, how many people came on which days, which cars parked at which entrance, who used the front door, who used the back. She knew my younger brother went to my uncle's cafe on Wolf Street every Friday night, sat at the same table at the far end, from 9 o'clock until 11 o'clock, every week. For 3 years. She wrote that down on a piece of paper, and she gave it to someone. He stopped. My brother's name was Gianni. He was 22. He died because of that piece of paper. No one said anything. The refrigerator in the corner of the kitchen clicked once and began to run, and the steady hum of the compressor filled the room, and for a very long time, no one spoke. Josie looked toward the old woman. Antonia was sitting with her back straight, both hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles had gone white beneath the thin skin. She wasn't crying. Her eyes were dry, fixed on some point on the plastic tabletop. I opened the door and let her in, she said. Her voice was low and hard as stone. I poured her coffee, with my own hands, the blue cup. I always kept that one aside for her because she said she liked it. Josie started to reach across the table to place her hand over Antonia's, then stopped halfway. Because there were some kinds of pain that touching would only insult, she drew her hand back. For 4 years, she hasn't left the house alone, Rocco said. Someone takes her where she needs to go. Someone brings her home. Not because I want to keep her prisoner, because I can't sit in my office without knowing who my mother is sitting with. He raised his head and looked directly at Josie for the first time since he'd sat down. So last Tuesday, when I learned my mother had disappeared for the 11th time, and when my man reported that a 27-year-old woman had just helped her carry something in a parking lot 2.5 miles from her house, a woman who owed $41,000. I didn't see kindness, Miss Hartley. He spoke the final sentence very softly. I saw history repeating itself, and I did what I always do with things that repeat themselves. Josie sat there with her hands in her lap, and she realized that the anger she'd carried home from Il Passero, the anger she'd held onto for 4 days like a burning coal, had just cooled by half. Only half. She stood, walked to the window, and looked down at the wet street below. Then she said without turning around, "Would you come out into the hallway with me for a minute? I have something I need to tell you, too." The hallway was colder than the apartment and darker, because the light at the far end had burned out the month before, and no one had bothered to replace it. Josie closed the door behind her, leaving the old woman alone with the tin of cookies and the refrigerator that had just been seen. The two of them stood on opposite sides of the hallway, their backs against facing walls, about 1.5 arms length apart, both looking down at the floor. Neither looked at the other. Maybe that was why she was able to say it. "My father left when I was 19, Josie said. "He didn't die. He just left. One Wednesday morning he said he was going out to buy cigarettes, and he never came back. My mother kept his coat hanging on the hook by the door for another 2 years before she finally took it down." Rocco said nothing. "Before he left, he'd borrowed money," she said. "He laid tile for a living. He took on a contract that was bigger than he could handle. He needed capital, and a bank wouldn't lend money to a man like him, so he borrowed somewhere else. In this neighborhood, everybody knows who somewhere else means." She raised her eyes toward the dead light at the end of the hallway. He borrowed from your family. Back when your father was still alive." She heard Rocco draw in a breath, very softly. "I don't know exactly how much it was because my mother never said the number out loud. All I know is that he couldn't pay it back, and he left, and the debt didn't leave with him. It stayed. It stayed with a 43-year-old woman and 2 children. One 19 years old, and the other not even old enough to walk." Josie folded her arms across her chest. "Not because she was cold. My mother worked 3 jobs then. In the mornings, she cleaned hotel rooms downtown. In the afternoons, she worked at a laundry. At night, she brought clothes home to iron. She slept 4 hours a day for 6 years straight, and later people told me that wasn't what killed her, but I've never really believed them." She paused for a beat. "Then one day she went. She put on her best coat, combed her hair, and went to your house." Rocco lifted his head. Josie was still looking at the floor. "She stood outside your door in the rain and knocked. She was going to ask if she could make payments. She wasn't asking for the debt to be erased. She would have never dared ask for that. She only wanted to pay a little every month, so people would stop coming to the house. She practiced that sentence the whole way there. That's what she told me." Josie swallowed. "I don't know how long she stood there. All I know is that she came home at 10 o'clock that night with her hair soaked through. And she didn't say anything. She took off her coat, hung it up, then went and finished ironing the rest of the clothes. Later, she said only one sentence to me about what happened. She said, 'They wouldn't open the door for me, sweetheart.'" The hallway fell silent. From an apartment somewhere below came the sound of a television, the laughter from some comedy show drifting up the stairwell. "For 8 years I've lived with the fear of someone knocking on the door," Josie said. "Do you understand? Not fear of going hungry, not fear of being thrown out on the street. I was already used to those things. It's the knocking. Every time someone knocks, I stop breathing. My mother has been gone for 2 years, and I don't even know where that debt sits anymore. But tonight, when your mother knocked 3 times out there, I still stood behind that door holding my breath before I opened it." She turned her head, and for the first time, she looked directly at him in the dark hallway. "So listen carefully. That day in the parking lot, I didn't know that old woman was your mother, but when she told me about a son that everybody in this neighborhood takes off their hats for, I knew. I knew right then, standing in the rain with the cap from her coffee still in my hand." Her voice grew firmer. "I didn't help your mother despite knowing who she was. I helped her because I knew. I was paying a debt that wasn't mine, because my mother never got the chance to finish paying hers." Rocco stood there with his back against the peeling wall, and he remained silent for a very long time. Long enough that Josie thought he wasn't going to say anything at all. "So you have a file on me too," he finally said. "No." She shook her head. "I have a scar. That's different." He raised a hand and rubbed his face, a tired and deeply human gesture, the kind of gesture that an hour earlier she couldn't have imagined this man making. "I was wrong," he said. "I wasn't just wrong. I was cruel. I'm sorry." There was no but after it. No explanation added to soften what he'd done. Josie waited, because she was used to apologies always having a tail, and that tail was always where people took back their share of being right. Nothing came. There was only the sound of the television drifting up from the floor below. "I accept your apology," she said, "but I need you to hear one thing. That envelope the other day, you didn't offer it to me. You pointed it at me. You used it exactly the way someone uses a gun, to make me either take it or disappear." She looked at him. "Don't ever do that to me again." "There won't be a next time," Rocco said. "I promise." And he kept that promise. Every single word of it. When the two of them went back inside, Antonia had already opened the tin of cookies and arranged them on 3 plates she'd found on her own in the cupboard, and on the table in front of her was a sheet of paper folded into quarters that hadn't been there before. She waited until they were both seated before unfolding it and smoothing it flat with her palm. It was a hand-drawn plan, done in ballpoint pen, measured with a ruler, with places that had been erased and drawn again. A 2-story building with a 3-bay facade and a roll-up door in the center. The ground floor had been divided into small squares with labels written inside them, and in the corner of the page was an address written in capital letters. Reed Street. "What's this?" Josie asked. "A building," Antonia said. "I bought it. Signed the papers last Friday." Rocco snapped his head toward his mother. Clearly this was the first he'd heard of it. "My money," the old woman said before he could open his mouth. The money my husband left specifically to me, plus the house in Camden that I sold last year. Not $1 of yours, not $1 from the company. My lawyer handled everything. If you want to see the papers, I'll show them to you tomorrow." She turned back to Josie and tapped a finger against the drawing. "I'm turning the ground floor into a clinic for people in the neighborhood. No charge. You know how many people around here don't have insurance? Old Italian women, Vietnamese women, Mexican women, men working in restaurants without papers. They get sick and they endure it. And when they can't endure it anymore, they go to the emergency room, then spend the rest of their lives carrying a bill they can never pay." She paused. "You understand that, don't you?" Josie looked down at the paper and couldn't answer. 3 examination rooms here," Antonia said, pointing. "This is the waiting area. This is reception. And this little room is for records. I have 6 doctors who've agreed to take rotating shifts. All old friends of my husband's. They're retired now. They have time. 2 nurses, too, part-time." She smoothed the paper again. "I'm naming it Gianni." No one spoke. Rocco looked at the name written in the upper corner of the page, and his face didn't change, but the hand resting on the table slowly closed. "The person I hired to run the place," Antonia continued, her voice sharpening, "quit last week. Took a job at a bigger hospital for more money. I don't blame him. But now I have a building, 6 retired doctors, and nobody to open the door at 6 o'clock in the morning." She pointed directly at Josie. "I need this girl." "No." Rocco said that one word, and he said it in front of Josie, without lowering his voice, without waiting for her to leave the room. "You just sat here and listened to what I told you 8 minutes ago." "I heard you. Then listen to me say it again. I don't know this person. I know a piece of paper about this person. And you're planning to hand someone I know only from a piece of paper a place with my brother's name hanging on the wall." Antonia didn't look up from the drawing. "I didn't ask your permission." 4 words. She said them in the voice Josie imagined she'd used for 30 years to tell her 2 sons to wash their hands before dinner, and the man sitting across from her fell completely silent. "Listen carefully, Josie," the old woman said, turning toward her. "I'm not hiring you as a nurse. You left after 3 years, so you don't have a license. You aren't allowed to touch anyone. That's the law, and I don't break the law. What I need is a coordinator. Open the doors, close the doors. Make schedules for 6 difficult old doctors. Keep the records organized. When someone comes in, ask where it hurts. See which doctor is working that day, and get them into the right room. If they can't speak English, find a way. If they don't have papers, don't ask for papers. If they come in with something this place can't treat, know where to send them." She looked at Josie. "You've waited tables for 9 years. You can keep 40 tables in your head at once. Who ordered what? Who's allergic to what? Which table is getting angry? This job and that one are the same thing. The only difference is that here, people aren't angry because their food is late." Josie sat quietly with her hands in her lap. She looked at the drawing, then at the man sitting across from her. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring out the window, his jaw clenched, and his entire posture said one thing very clearly. He didn't want her inside that building, didn't want her anywhere near the name that would be hanging on that wall, and if there were any way for him to stop it, he would. She knew that. She accepted the job knowing it. "What's the salary?" she asked. Antonia gave her a number. Josie had to calculate it twice in her head before she believed it. It was more than twice what she earned working 2 shifts a day, 6 days a week, not counting tips. "There's insurance," the old woman added. "I asked my lawyer. Dependents are covered, too." Josie placed both hands on the table. She thought about the follow-up appointment slip with the date circled in red, pinned to the refrigerator door 3 steps away. Then she looked up and spoke in the same calm voice she used when taking one more table at the end of a shift. "All right. But I choose the suppliers for the medical supplies. I don't trust your son's taste in shopping. That plastic sewing machine that broke after 3 months is still evidence." Antonia burst out laughing. It was the only laughter of the entire evening, hoarse and brief, and it made the little kitchen feel just a little warmer. 4 months passed faster than any 4 months in Josie's life. The building on Reed Street slowly changed from a damp, moldy brick shell with debris scattered across the floor into a place that could actually open its doors. The first month was clearing and demolition. The second was plumbing and electrical work. By the 3rd month, the smell of fresh paint had completely overtaken the smell of dampness, and Josie stood in the middle of the waiting room looking at 14 plastic chairs arranged in 2 perfectly straight rows and felt her throat tighten for no sensible reason at all. On the wall beside the door, she posted the duty schedule for the 6 retired doctors, drawing the grid with markers, 1 color for each doctor, and she had to redo it 4 times during the first 2 weeks, because 2 of the men absolutely refused to work on the same day after something that had happened back in 1979. Antonia sewed every curtain for the 3 examination rooms on the same cast-iron sewing machine they'd lifted into the Buick that day, and Rocco was there at 6 o'clock in the morning nearly every day, his shirt sleeves rolled up, carrying box after box of supplies inside from the car with his own hands. Josie didn't ask why. She didn't ask why he barely spoke to her, either, beyond the words that were necessary. In the 2nd month, she enrolled in school again, night classes at the community college, Tuesdays and Thursdays, from 7 o'clock until 9:30. On the first night, she sat in the back row, her hands trembling as she opened her notebook, fully prepared to discover that after 8 years away, everything in her head had rotted beyond use. But by the 3rd week, when the instructor asked about an early sign of dehydration in older adults, Josie answered before she even had time to think, and the answer came out whole from some place inside her she'd thought had been closed for years. She went home that night and sat for a very long time on the front steps of her apartment building, not because she was sad. Then came a Friday afternoon, about 3 weeks before the clinic was scheduled to open. Josie walked out of the records room with a stack of folders in her arms, still carrying the clean smell of new paper, and stopped in the doorway of examination room 1. Inside, Mr. Bruno, the 81-year-old man who lived in the apartment across the hall, was sitting on the examination table with his sleeve rolled up, and Rocco Vitali was standing beside him, holding the rubber bulb of a manual blood pressure cuff, his face as serious as if he were defusing a bomb. "Sit still, please," he said. "I'm already sitting still," Mr. Bruno replied. "I've been sitting still this whole time." Josie stood in the doorway watching for another 3 seconds before she spoke. "You've wrapped it 2 finger widths too high. It'll give you the wrong reading." Rocco turned around. For 1 second, she saw the old reflex appear on his face, the reflex of a man who wasn't accustomed to being caught doing something wrong. Then he lowered his hands. "Antonia asked me to check Mr. Bruno's blood pressure because no one's on duty today," he said. "My mother believes that if people do something often enough, they'll eventually become good at it." "She's right. The problem is, this is your first time." Josie set the stack of folders on the table, walked over, and removed the cuff. "Mr. Bruno, put your arm down on the table for me, palm facing up, with your forearm level with your heart." The old man obeyed immediately, his eyes still fixed on Rocco with an expression of deep sympathy. Josie wrapped the cuff again, slipping her fingers beneath it to check the fit. The bottom edge should be about 2 finger widths above the bend of the elbow. Not too tight. If you can slide 2 fingers underneath, that's about right. She handed the bulb back to him. "And you've got the stethoscope in the wrong place. You're putting it over the tendon, not the artery." She took hold of his wrist. She did it completely naturally, exactly the way she'd done hundreds of times during her 3 years of nursing school. And it wasn't until 2 seconds later that she realized whose wrist she was holding. She didn't let go. She simply guided his hand downward and placed 2 of his fingers against the inside of Mr. Bruno's elbow. "Feel that? Can you feel it beating?" He was silent for a moment. "Yes. That's the brachial artery. Put the stethoscope over that spot. Don't press too hard. If you press too hard, you'll lose it." She put the earpieces into his ears and adjusted them so they wouldn't slip out. "Pump it up to about 180, then release the pressure slowly, about 2 marks per second. The first beat you hear is the top number. When the sound disappears completely, that's the bottom number." Rocco began pumping, and Josie, standing half a step away, saw something she would remember for a very long time afterward. The man's hand was trembling slightly. Not much, just the faint tremor of someone accustomed to controlling everything within his sight, now having to do something he wasn't good at in front of someone who knew perfectly well that he wasn't good at it. He opened the valve. The entire room fell silent. 140, he said. Then, a little while later, 82. Josie checked the gauge. That's right. And Rocco Vitali looked up at her, the stethoscope still in his ears, and smiled. Not the polite half-smile from the restaurant. A real smile, appearing so quickly that it changed his entire face. the smile of a little boy who had just caught a ball for the first time. "I did it," he said. "You did, mister," Bruno said with a solemn nod. "Only took you 15 minutes. Josie turned away to hide her own smile, picked up the stack of folders, and walked out. And in that moment, the distance between their two worlds, the distance that a white tablecloth at Il Passero had stretched between them, disappeared completely in the simple motion of one hand showing another where to place a stethoscope. The following Thursday, Josie left class at 9:35, later than usual because she'd stayed behind to ask her instructor about a chapter she didn't understand. The street outside was nearly empty, the streetlights casting pale light across the pavement, still damp from earlier rain, and she was standing on the steps of the community college, fastening the buttons of her coat, when her eyes settled on the car parked across the street. A dark gray sedan, parked about 100 feet from the school entrance, its lights off, its engine still running, a thin ribbon of exhaust drifting into the cold air. Josie had seen it before, not just once. She stood still and began counting backward in her head. The previous Tuesday, she remembered a car parked in that same spot, because she'd had to walk around it to reach the bus stop. The week before that, it had been there too. The month before, on the night it hailed, she distinctly remembered a car sitting there with its engine running in exactly the same place, because she'd wondered who would sit inside a car for that long. She moved backward through her memory, evening after evening, Tuesday and Thursday, counting all the way back to the first week she'd enrolled in school again. 4 months, every night she had class. She crossed the street and knocked on the window. The glass rolled down. The man behind the wheel looked to be in his 40s, with a square face and short salt and pepper hair, and he didn't startle or look surprised. He simply looked at her. "Good evening, Miss Hartley. You know my name. Mickey Cardone," he said. "I work for Mr. Vitale." Josie stood there with her hands in her coat pockets and waited for him to say something else. Some excuse, some polite lie like "I just happened to park here." Nothing came. Mickey Cardone simply sat there with both hands on the steering wheel, waiting for her next question. It was that calmness that chilled her. "How long?" she asked. "Since you started school?" "All 4 months?" "All 4 months." Josie nodded slowly. Then she turned away, and she didn't take the bus home. She walked 11 blocks to Reed Street. And through all 11 of those blocks, she couldn't form a single, complete thought. The lights inside the clinic were still on. Rocco was in the reception area, standing beside several boxes of unassembled chairs and a coil of electrical wire still lying across the floor, holding a supply invoice in one hand. He looked up when he heard the door. "What are you doing here this late?" "Mickey Cardone," Josie said. He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't pretend not to understand. He simply placed the invoice on the counter, very slowly, and she understood immediately that he'd known this day would come. 4 months, she said. Tuesday and Thursday, every week. He parks across the street for 2.5 hours waiting for me to leave class. Since the day I enrolled, which means he was there before I even had the chance to open my first notebook. Rocco said nothing. "Deny it," Josie said. "Please, tell me he happened to be passing by. Tell me you had someone watching over me because that neighborhood is dark. Tell me something." "I'm not going to deny it," he said. "I promised you I would never use money against you again. I've kept that promise, and I'll continue to keep it, but I never promised I would stop protecting my mother." Josie stood motionless among the boxes of unassembled chairs. "You're not protecting her," she said. "Don't call it that. Protecting her means standing outside her door. What he's doing is sitting outside my classroom to see who I meet, whether I hand anything to anyone, whether anyone gives anything to me." Her voice began to turn hoarse. "You're waiting for me to make a mistake. For 4 months, I've worked beside you. I've opened this building with you at 6 o'clock in the morning. I held your wrist and taught you where to put a stethoscope, while you were counting every step I took. Yes, one word." He didn't raise his voice when he said it. He didn't look away. He didn't add anything afterward to soften it. And that was what hurt Josie most. If he'd denied it, she could have been angry. If he'd invented an excuse, she could have pointed out the lie and given herself permission to feel betrayed. But he said yes, and that single word took away everything she might have held on to. It meant that for 4 months, while he carried boxes of supplies at 6 o'clock in the morning, while he smiled that smile of a little boy who had just caught a ball, while he stood there listening to her explain the brachial artery, somewhere inside him, in some locked compartment. She was still lying on a sheet of paper. Her name never crossed off. "I told you about my mother," she said softly. "Out in that hallway. I hadn't told anyone that story in 8 years. You listened to me. You apologized. And then the next morning you still had that man following me." "I didn't tell him to follow you," Rocco said. "I simply never withdrew the old order." "What's the difference?" He had no answer. Josie looked around the room, at the unassembled chairs, the coil of electrical wire, the empty wall where, in 3 weeks, a brass plaque bearing his brother's name would hang. Then, she placed the clinic key on the reception counter beside the invoice. "I'll still come open the doors tomorrow," she said. "For your mother, not for you. But tonight, I'm going home." And she turned her back, pushed open the glass door, and stepped outside. For the first time in this entire story, she was the one who walked out of the room, and he was the one left standing behind. 3 days later, Josie was sitting in the little cafe diagonally across the street from the clinic, the place where she always ate lunch because it was cheap, and because from there she could see the glass doors on the other side, when a man pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down without asking. He looked close to 60, wore a good wool coat, his hair neatly combed, and he smiled at her with the warm smile of an uncle at a family gathering. "Miss Hartley, mind if I sit here for a minute?" Josie put down her fork. Beneath the table, her hand slipped into her coat pocket and touched her phone. She didn't know why she did it. Maybe because in 9 years of waiting tables, she'd learned that when a stranger sat down, already knowing your name, he always wanted something. Her thumb found the record button and pressed it. "Who are you?" "Frank Bellini." He placed both hands on the table, palms up, as if to show her they were empty. "I worked for Rocco's father before you were even born. 31 years. I held that boy in my arms before he was a year old. Then why are you looking for me?" "I'm only here to talk." He ordered a cup of coffee, spoke very politely to the waitress, and thanked her twice. Then he turned back to Josie. "His father was a formidable man, Miss Hartley. He built all of that from nothing. Back in a time when people like us weren't allowed through the front door anywhere. He kept it standing through 4 generations of police chiefs. He never let one of his own go hungry. You understand what I'm saying?" "No." "Then he died, and the boy took over." Bellini stirred his coffee. "I don't blame him. At 26, who would have done any differently? But for the last 4 years, he's gone soft, Miss Hartley. He's pulled out of places his father had to spill blood just to get into. And now he's taking dead men's money and buying a building on Reed Street so he can hand out free medicine to old women without insurance." He said it in that same warm voice, without sarcasm, and that was precisely what made it frightening. "Antonia bought that building with her own money," Josie said. "I know. You think I don't know?" Bellini smiled. "You're a good girl. You protect them. That's good." Then he reached inside his coat. Josie's body tightened, and what he pulled out was a sheet of paper, just one sheet. He placed it on the table, turned it so she could read it, and pushed it toward her. The paper had yellowed with age, its edges curled, one corner stained by moisture. It was a page torn from a ledger, ruled with lines and handwritten in ink. 1 column of names, 1 column of numbers. And on the 4th line from the top, Josie saw her father's name, Hartley. Beside it was a number she'd imagined for 8 years but had never once seen with her own eyes. Next to the number was an abbreviation stamped in red ink, and at the bottom of the page, beneath the entries, was a signature. Firm strokes, leaning slightly backward. R. Vitale. And beside it, a date. Josie stared at that date for a long time. 8 years ago, the spring of the year she turned 19. "He signed this the same year your father disappeared," Bellini said, his voice as light as if he were talking about the weather. "The entire private debt ledger. He wiped it clean in a single afternoon. Some people say he did it to clean things up. I think differently." He took a sip of coffee. "Miss Hartley, you're a smart woman. I can see that just by looking at you. So you tell me, a 76-year-old woman who hasn't been allowed out of the house alone for 4 years suddenly loses her escorts 11 times. Suddenly drives off to buy a cast-iron sewing machine she can't lift by herself, in the exact parking lot you walk through every day after your lunch shift." He set down his cup. "You think she just happened to find you in that parking lot?" Josie sat perfectly still. Somewhere inside her chest, something began to fall, slowly, taking a very long time to reach the bottom. "What do they call that again?" Bellini said as he stood and buttoned his coat. Not kindness. There's another name for it. I'll let you figure it out. He gave her a polite nod, left money for his coffee beneath the saucer, and paused beside the table for a beat. Keep the paper. I made a copy. I just think a woman has the right to know why she was chosen. Then he walked out of the cafe. Josie remained sitting alone for a very long time, one hand resting on the yellowed sheet of paper, while everything from the past 4 months rearranged itself inside her mind into a new order she didn't want to see. The old woman's nod when she'd heard the name Hartley. The oddly pointed question about Mr. Otis's diner. The look in the parking lot that Josie had thought strange at the time. The look of someone checking off a line that had been waiting there for a very long time. She folded the paper into quarters, carefully, and slipped it into the inside pocket of her coat. Then she reached beneath the table, took out her phone, and looked at the screen. The red numbers were still running, 22 minutes and 46 seconds. She pressed stop. She saved it, and she named the recording with today's date, exactly the way someone would label a medical record, then stood, paid for her meal, and walked toward the clinic. Because Josie Hartley wasn't merely a woman kind enough to push back an envelope containing $10,000. She was also a woman who had spent 9 years among drunken customers and bosses who cheated people out of their wages. And she'd learned a long time ago that when a stranger sat down across from you wearing a warm smile, the first thing you did wasn't trust him. It was press the button. Josie stayed at the clinic until nearly 9 o'clock that night. She told herself she was staying to finish entering the records. But the truth was that she stayed because she didn't know what to do with the paper in her coat pocket. And because if she went home, she would only sit there staring at it. By the time she locked the inside door, turned off the waiting room lights, and pushed open the glass door to step outside, the street was deserted. 2 men were standing near the entrance. They weren't completely blocking the way. They simply stood on either side of the steps, the way people stand when they're waiting for someone, and when she started down, both of them moved closer. Miss Hartley, one of them said. He was the younger one, tall, with his hands in his coat pockets. Mr. Bellini sends his regards. Josie stopped on the second step, about 1.5 feet above them, and tightened her grip on the strap of her bag. What does he want? Not much, just your phone. She didn't answer. There's a camera in the cafe, ma'am, the other man said. He was shorter and heavier, his voice almost gentle. It points down at the tables. Mr. Bellini watched the footage this afternoon. Your screen was lit for the whole 22 minutes. Josie felt the blood drain from her face. Hand it over, and everybody goes home, the younger man said. You don't lose anything. You can keep the paper. He gave it to you. No, Josie said. She said it very softly, and she didn't understand herself why she'd said it, instead of simply handing over the phone and ending the whole thing. Maybe because those 22 minutes contained the voice of a man who had carefully built a trap in front of her, and she knew that if she gave it away, she would never be able to prove to anyone that he'd sat there. The younger man sighed and stepped up one stair, and his hand grabbed the strap of her bag. Josie held on. The two of them pulled against each other. The bag sprang open, and several sheets from the clinic files scattered white across the steps. The other man stepped up to help. She twisted away, and as she turned, her shoulder struck hard against the glass door behind her. The glass gave a deep, heavy shudder in the empty street. She still didn't let go of the bag. Let go. The voice wasn't loud. It came from the darkness beside the streetlight on the other side of the fence, and it carried the calm of someone who had been standing there watching for some time and had already decided everything before he opened his mouth. Mickey Cardone stepped into the streetlight, his hands hanging at his sides, walking toward them very slowly. The 2 men turned. Josie clearly saw the moment the younger man recognized who he was looking at, because the hand gripping her bag strap suddenly loosened. Cardone, the man said. This doesn't concern you. 3 seconds, Mickey said. The younger man stayed exactly 2 more seconds. Then both men backed down the steps, retreated several paces, turned, and walked quickly toward the end of the street, their footsteps growing fainter until the street fell completely silent. Mickey bent down and picked up the papers scattered across the steps, smoothed them flat, and handed them back to her. Josie took them. Her hands were trembling so badly that the top sheet rustled. She sat down on the concrete steps, placed the bag on her lap, and stayed there without moving for a long while because her knees refused to hold her anymore. Mickey walked to his car, opened the door, then came back with an unopened bottle of water. He handed it to her, then sat down on the step below, leaving enough space between them. His face turned toward the street. Josie twisted open the cap with both trembling hands and took a sip. And as she drank, she realized the irony of the whole thing, arriving with a clarity and bitterness like medicine on her tongue. The car parked across the street from her school that she'd counted backward through 4 months to remember. The thing that had made her put her key on the counter and walk out of the clinic that night. The thing she'd hated so much that she hadn't slept for 3 nights. That very thing had just risen out of the darkness and pulled 2 men away from her. "You've been following me all night?" she asked. Mickey didn't turn around. "I've been following you since the day you enrolled." She laughed, a short laugh with nothing joyful in it. "Then I suppose you've had plenty to report. I go to school. I buy apple pie for my little brother. I eat lunch at that cheap cafe across the street." Mickey was silent for a moment. Then he said, still looking out at the street, exactly 1 sentence and nothing more. "I don't report on you, Miss Hartley. For 4 months, I've reported only one thing, that you're clean." Josie turned her head and looked at him. He didn't look back. She sat there a while longer, until her hands stopped trembling, until her breathing became steady again. Then she took out her phone. She didn't open her messages. She opened her contacts, found the name she'd saved 4 months earlier and had never once called, and pressed call. He answered on the second ring. "Josie?" She looked down at her other hand, the one still holding the bag with the yellowed sheet of paper folded into quarters inside. "Are you home?" she said. "I need to see you. Right now. What happened?" And Josie, sitting on the concrete steps outside the clinic that bore his brother's name, 10 minutes after 2 men had tried to tear her bag away from her in that exact spot, didn't say a single word about what had just happened. "I have a piece of paper," she said. "You signed it 8 years ago. I want you to look at it and tell me whether you remember the name on it." 40 minutes later, Josie was sitting in Rocco's office on the 2nd floor of a building on Passyunk Street, a bare room containing only a large wooden desk, 2 chairs, and a metal filing cabinet. She didn't take off her coat. She placed 2 things on the desk. The first was the yellowed sheet of paper, unfolded flat and turned toward him. The second was her phone, its screen lit, her finger resting on the play button. "Listen to all of it," she said. "Don't ask me anything until it stops." She pressed play, and Frank Bellini's voice began to fill the empty room, warm, slow, polite to the waitress, thanking her twice. Rocco sat perfectly still. He didn't interrupt once. When Bellini reached the part about his father, about 4 generations of police chiefs, about never letting one of his own go hungry, Rocco's expression didn't change. When the recording reached the part where Bellini said, "He's gone soft, miss," Hartley, he remained motionless, both hands resting on the desk. Only when Bellini said, "He's taking dead men's money and buying a building on Reed Street," did Rocco's fingers slowly close into fists, then open again. The recording continued to the final part. "You think she just happened to find you in that parking lot?" Then came the sound of a chair scraping back, the cafe door opening, followed by more than 20 minutes of lunchtime noise, dishes, voices, the sound of Josie's own breathing. She let it play all the way through. When the recording stopped, the room fell silent in the way only rooms with thick walls could truly become silent. Rocco looked at her for a long time. "Do you know what you just handed me?" he said. "I know." "No, let me finish." His voice dropped lower. "If you walked out of this room with that recording, there are at least 4 people in this city who would pay you 6 figures for it. I'm not speaking metaphorically. I'm talking names, addresses, and cash within 24 hours. Some people would pay to use it against me. Others would pay to use it against him. Both sides would pay." "I know," Josie said. "You know. Mr. Vitali. I've lived in this neighborhood for 27 years. I've waited tables for 9 years in a diner where half the regulars know one another's parents by name. You think I don't know what a recording like this is worth?" She looked directly at him. "I know exactly what it's worth. That's why I'm sitting here with it instead of somewhere else." "Then why didn't you sell it?" Josie reached out and pushed the yellowed sheet of paper across the desk toward him until it stopped directly in front of him. "Because I still haven't gotten an answer about this." Rocco looked down. He picked up the paper. Josie watched his eyes move down the column of names, stop at the 4th line, slide across to the column of numbers, then move to the bottom, where his own signature appeared beside the date. "You signed it in the spring of the year I turned 19, she said. "The same year my father left." The exact debt my mother stood in the rain outside your house and asked to pay in installments, and no one opened the door for her. Her voice was very calm, and it was that calmness that made it frightening. I told you that story in the hallway outside my apartment 4 months ago. You sat there and listened. You apologized to me. And you didn't tell me that your own signature had erased that debt 8 years earlier? She drew in a breath. You knew who I was before that, didn't you? Your mother didn't just happen to find me in that parking lot, did she? Rocco didn't answer. Josie waited. She'd prepared herself for 2 possibilities during the entire trip there. The first was that he would lie, and she would know immediately, and she would stand up and leave. The second was that he would admit it, and she would have to sit there and watch the last 4 months of her life break apart into pieces. She hadn't prepared for the third possibility, because Rocco Vitale was holding the paper in his hands and staring at his own signature with the expression of a man who didn't understand. He turned the paper toward the light. He looked at the date. He read the column of names again from top to bottom, more slowly this time, his lips moving faintly with each line. I don't remember this name, he said. Don't. I'm not lying to you. He placed the paper back on the desk and pushed it toward the middle where they could both see it. Count them. There are 34 names on this page. This is 1 page. That ledger had more than 200 pages. He looked up. During the first year after my father died, I wiped the entire private debt ledger clean in 1 afternoon. I didn't read every line. I signed at the bottom of each page, 1 page after another, until my hand hurt. I did it for reasons of my own, not because of anyone whose name was in that ledger. I never once read the name Hartley separately in my life, until the night I stood in the hallway outside your apartment. They sat in silence, and Josie realized something that sent a colder chill down her spine than anything Bellini had said in the cafe. Neither person in that room knew the answer. If it wasn't him, then who was it? Rocco reached for the phone. He dialed a single number, lifted it to his ear, and waited. When someone answered on the other end, he said exactly 3 words. Ma, come here. Antonia arrived 20 minutes later. She entered the room, removed her headscarf, and saw the yellowed sheet of paper lying in the middle of the desk before she even looked at the 2 people sitting there. She stopped in the center of the room, then she pulled out the 3rd chair and sat down very slowly like someone who knew she was going to be sitting there for a long time. Who gave you this? She asked. Frank Bellini, Josie said. The old woman nodded, as though that was the name she'd guessed from the moment she walked through the door. Rocco rested both elbows on the desk. Tell her, Ma. You go first, Antonia said. You tell your part first, then I'll tell mine. So he did. He told her about that afternoon 8 years earlier, the 3rd afternoon after his father's funeral, when he'd had all 6 private debt ledgers carried up from the basement and spread across the dining table. He didn't read them. He had 2 of his men sit on either side of him and turn the pages while he signed at the bottom of each one, page after page, from 3 o'clock in the afternoon until nearly 9 o'clock at night, until he could no longer feel his fingers. Don't mistake that for kindness, he told Josie without looking at her. It wasn't. My father kept those ledgers for 30 years. He knew the names of every wife and every child belonging to every person in them. He lent money without paperwork, without any clearly stated interest, and he called it helping people in the neighborhood. But those ledgers were a rope, and he tied that rope around the necks of 200 families. He paused. I didn't erase those debts because I cared about anyone. I erased them because I wanted to finish burying him. I wanted that part of the business to die with him. That's all. Antonia sat silently through all of it, both hands resting in her lap. Then she said, That night, he went to bed. I went downstairs. Josie turned toward her. The 6 ledgers were still lying on the dining table, the old woman said. I made a pot of coffee and sat there from 10 o'clock at night until 4 o'clock in the morning. I turned every page. I don't know why I did it. I only thought that if my husband had written down 200 pages of people's names, then someone ought to read them at least once. She reached out and touched her index finger to the sheet of paper on the desk, directly on the 4th line. Then I came to this name. Hartley. She drew her hand back. I remembered immediately. I didn't have to think. 8 years before that, a woman came and knocked on my door. It was raining. I stood behind the door, looked through the peephole, and saw her hair wet and stuck to her face. She was wearing a good coat, the kind people only wear to church. Antonia continued, her voice steady, her eyes never leaving the desk. My husband had a rule. Business didn't come home, and I wasn't to involve myself in it. If I opened that door, he would know, and that woman would suffer more for it. That's what I told myself for 8 years. I told myself I didn't open the door because it was better for her that way. She breathed out, but the truth is, I didn't open it because I was afraid of my husband. That's all. There was nothing noble about it. No one spoke. She knocked 3 times, Antonia said. Then she stood there a little longer. Then she left. Josie sat perfectly still. She thought about her mother's best coat, and she thought about the only sentence her mother had ever spoken about that night. "So after you read that name, what did you do?" she asked. "I looked for you." The old woman raised her head for the first time. "It took me 4 years. Not because you were difficult to find. Finding you was easy. It took me 4 years because I didn't know what I was supposed to do once I found you. I couldn't bring you money. You understand? A woman stands in the rain and doesn't receive the one thing she came asking for. Then 8 years later, someone brings money to her daughter. That daughter will throw it back in their face. I know people like that. I grew up surrounded by people like that." Rocco turned toward his mother, and Josie saw on his face the expression of a man hearing this story for the first time. "So I went to Mr. Otis's diner," Antonia said. "I sat there for 3 months." Josie raised a hand to cover her mouth. "At the counter beside the kitchen. Mr. Otis served me. Not at one of your tables. I came between your shifts, when you were in the back changing clothes or sitting in the corner of the kitchen eating, and I sat there drinking coffee and watching through the service window." The old woman looked at Josie. "I watched how you treated people. That table of 8 left you a $4 tip on Friday, and you still wished them a good night. The drunk man sitting at the table in the back, you didn't throw him out. You brought him a glass of water and called him a cab. A little boy spilled water all over the floor, and his mother panicked and started apologizing. You told her it was all right, that he'd helped you mop the floor. Then you handed the boy a towel so he could feel useful." She added more softly, "I sat there for 3 months, and I never once saw you pretend." "But why?" Josie asked. Her voice had begun to break. "Why were you looking for me?" Antonia didn't answer immediately. She looked toward her son, and there was something in that look very much like a plea. "Because my son has been sitting in that house for 4 years, she said. "Everyone around him is either afraid of him or wants something from him. I've counted. In this entire city, there isn't one person who comes near him who doesn't belong to one of those 2 kinds. I'm 76 years old. I've buried my husband. I've buried 1 son. And I don't want to die and leave him alone among those 2 kinds of people." The old woman looked down at the desk. "That Tuesday afternoon, I lost his man for the 11th time. I drove to the flea market and bought a sewing machine I didn't need because I already have 3 at home. I parked behind the church, on the route you always walk to the bus stop after your lunch shift. Then I waited." She placed both hands on the desk, and her knuckles went white again, just as they had that night in the little kitchen. "I closed a door in your mother's face," Antonia said. "I can't open that door again, so I opened another one." Josie sat motionless for 3 seconds. Then she stood, picked up her coat, and walked out of the room. She didn't slam the door. She simply left, and Rocco Vitali remained sitting exactly where he was. He didn't stand. He didn't call after her, because this time he understood that there were moments when letting someone walk outside and breathe was the only kindness you had left to give them. 9 days after that night, Rocco Vitali called a meeting of the family council in the private dining room at the back of Il Passero, and he brought no one with him except Mickey Cardone. He didn't raise his voice either. He simply placed 4 sets of ledgers and a stack of statements on the table, then let the people sitting around it read for themselves. Over 4 years, Frank Bellini had taken from the common fund an amount that, once added together, left no one in the room willing to look him in the eye anymore. And among that money was the monthly support. The family had continued sending to Gianni's mother-in-law since the day he died. The recording was played last, and it was only the final nail driven into a board already sealed shut. Bellini was stripped of every role he held in a single afternoon, lost his privileges, lost his seat, and was given 3 days to leave the city. When he stood to walk out, Rocco said exactly 1 sentence to him. "You once held me in your arms. That's why you get to leave on your own 2 feet. Don't come back." Out in the hallway, when only the 2 of them remained, he told Josie something he'd never told anyone. 3 years. For 3 years, he'd been planning to move everything into legitimate operations, one piece at a time, and his lawyers had been working on it since the previous fall. Not because of the law, he said, because I don't want another name hanging on that wall. That same week, Josie received a letter from the hospital saying that the full cost of her little brother's surgery had been approved. She read it 3 times, then carried it straight to the clinic, her hands trembling with anger because she could think of only one possible explanation. Antonia was sitting at the reception desk. She listened to everything, then opened the bottom drawer and took out a file with an old denial letter clipped inside. It was the very application Josie herself had submitted to the Community Assistance Fund during the 2nd month, the application that had been returned because it lacked the confirming signature of a sponsoring medical facility, the application she'd folded up, put away, and stopped thinking about. Once the clinic received its facility identification number, the old woman found it, obtained the signature, and resubmitted it herself. "Nobody gave you anything," Antonia said, pushing the file toward her. "I only finished the step where you stopped." On a Saturday morning in June, the Reed Street Clinic opened its doors. By 6:45, people were already lined up along the sidewalk, the line stretching past 2 storefronts, most of them elderly, some carrying folding chairs. Antonia sat behind the reception desk, where the tabletop was covered with a cloth she'd sewn herself on that same cast-iron sewing machine, and she called each person by first and last name, as though she'd known them for 30 years. Behind the desk, on the freshly painted white wall, hung a small brass plaque engraved with the name Gianni Vitale. 9-year-old Danny, fully recovered from his surgery, ran all over the waiting room with a roll of tape in his hand and taped his drawing of the fire truck to the inside of the glass door, right where the sunlight fell across it. Then he pulled each person over to look at it, pointing to the enormously long ladder and explaining with complete seriousness that it had to be that long or it wouldn't reach the 4th floor. 81-year-old Mr. Bruno nodded thoughtfully and said, That's right. You thought that through." Near noon, Josie and Rocco sat on the concrete steps outside the entrance with 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper from the corner shop. At the curb, Antonia's old Buick was parked partly across the walkway, ugly and rusted around the wheel wells. A car that should have been sitting in a junkyard years ago, but somehow it had carried all of them here. That day at the restaurant, Rocco said, "You were the first person in 10 years to push money back toward me." "I almost took it," Josie said. "But you didn't." "No. Some things, once you sell them, you can't buy them back. Kindness isn't an investment, and that is exactly why it is the one thing in this world no one can ever buy. Some people spend their entire lives behind armor simply because they once opened the door to the wrong person. Some people spend their entire lives carrying the memory of a door they once closed. And sometimes, saving a human being begins with nothing more than reaching out and taking hold of one end of something too heavy for one person to carry alone. 3 months of waiting by an old woman changed the entire life of a waitress. And if this story touched you, please leave a like. Share it with someone you think might also need to be reminded that kindness is never meaningless. And subscribe to our channel to hear more compelling stories every day. How did today's story make you feel? And if you had been Josie sitting in front of that envelope, what would you have done? Please leave a comment below. We truly hope to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in each and every day. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next video.